Well, this year's Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded today. It went to French author Annie Ernaux. The 82-year-old is known for her deceptively simple novels. She's also just one of 17 women to have won that prestigious award since it first started in 1901. We're going to dive more deeply into just who Annie Ernaux is, as well as what her work is like, with France 24's book editor, Kathy Clifford. Hi, Kathy. Okay. Also with me on the set is Alice McCrum. Alice, you're the programs manager at the American Library in Paris. Thanks for coming on set. Kathy, let me start with you. Annie Ernaux, tell us about her.
So she's an esteemed French author, her work mostly autobiographical, and yes, 82 years old, as you say. She was honoured by the Swedish Academy for the courage and clinical acuity with which she uncovers the roots, estrangements and collective restraints of personal memory. Now, she's written more than 20 books, which are actually used in French schools as texts in French language classes. And they really follow through the passage from her background in a working class family right up to the French literary elite. And she reacted to the jury. She said it's a great honour and responsibility to be chosen for the prize.
Now, a lot of her work is autobiographical. Alice, is Annie Ernaux someone who's well known at the American Library? Have her works been translated? Do people ask for her books?
She's certainly very well known. I mean, she's a perennial kind of front runner for the Nobel Prize. So to kind of dig more deeply into what is she writing about, probably her most famous book is Les Années, The Years, which is an autobiography. But she chooses to write her autobiography, interestingly, not in the first person, but in the third person. So she uses she and one and us to tell the story of kind of post-World War II France up until the early 2000s. She talks about her mother's aging. She talks about her abortion. She's really excavating her life and the life of France.
And she's also the 17th woman since 1901 to have won this award.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it raises the question, you know, is this a surprise? What kind of reaction will we have? So a step in the right direction towards the kind of gender equality that the Academy are having to step up to after their Me Too scandal in 2017. But then, of course, 17 women since 1901, so still a bit of work to be done there. And in terms of international representation, obviously English language book authors have the most representation within the laureates, and France is second within that. So it's still not underrepresented for an international prize. So that could be criticised.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. So last year we had Abdulrazak Gurnah, who was the first black writer to win the prize since 1993 when Toni Morrison won it. I mean, if we think about the long history of the prize, 117 people have won it. As you say, Kathy, 95 of those people have come from Europe or North America. So at a time when there are many conversations happening about inclusion and diversity in the world of culture, it seems like the Swedish Academy is fairly impervious to these discussions, and it remains to be seen, therefore, what position they'll hold in the 21st century.
Kathy, you were mentioning before how the French are so obviously happy about this being Annie Ernaux. It's interesting, there's no official shortlist for the Nobel Prize, but some of the names that were bandied around were another French author, Michel Houellebecq, but also Salman Rushdie. Were you surprised that he did not win the Nobel this year?
I think so. There were strong calls from people like David Remnick, who's the new American editor of The New Yorker, somebody like Bernard-Henri Lévy, another French writer, calling for the Swedish Academy, who claim to kind of uphold the tenet of freedom of expression, saying if you really uphold this tenet, you should award it to Salman Rushdie, who again and again over the course of his life has put his literal life on the line to preserve this value in India, where he was born, and in the US, where he's kind of adopted his home.
Right, Salman Rushdie, who just recently survived another attack not that long ago. Kathy, what were your thoughts a bit more on some of the other front runners and the fact that they weren't named? And might some critics say that perhaps Annie Ernaux was named just because she's a woman?
Well, I suppose that's what they will say. They want to really choose the work of literary merit. I suppose one of the front runners, of course, was a prominent Russian author who's been very critical of the Kremlin, and many people might have liked to see a strong statement against Moscow's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I'd imagine, like many awards, there are always a little bit of politics behind the choices as well. Let's talk more broadly about the Nobel Prize. What exactly can it do for an author?
Oh, well, a lot. I mean, so there's the kind of material side and then there's the cultural side. So materially, one is going to which she will win now $1.1 million, which is an enormous amount of money for a writer. She'll win a medal, she'll win a diploma. Many of her books will now have more sales than they did before across the world. So it's really important to highlight that the Nobel Prize for Literature acknowledges a whole body of work. So oftentimes a prize like the Man Booker in the UK, like the Goncourt in France, it's highlighting one book. So all of her books will rise in sales, and she'll join a pantheon of other, celebrated writers from the 20th century, 21st century.
Alice, you mentioned Annie Ernaux's book, The Years. Are there any other books that you would recommend to people who perhaps don't know her work?
Yeah, so there's L'Événement, which again I mentioned is about her abortion. So in a year where Roe v. Wade was overturned, I think that's going to be an obvious place that people turn to. It poses the interesting question. The Swedish Academy, as Kathy kind of alluded to, says that it doesn't really acknowledge mainstream conversations. It's not really interested in the news, and yet this is a writer who's tackled the issue of abortion. The other book that I would recommend is La Place, The Place, in which she investigates her relationship essentially with her class. So she was born, as Kathy also mentioned, to a working class background. And she has a very famous line where she says you have to betray your class in order to become a writer when you come from a place like Normandy, working class Normandy.
I think it's interesting as well. Right now, there's a real trend for women writing autofiction, delving into taboos, which is fantastic. But Annie Ernaux, of course, has been doing this for years. And in France, she's really seen as one of the front runners, one of the first women to write in a style that was previously seen as masculine. Minimalist sentences, no frills, tending more towards the factual than the sentimental. And using really this sort of clinical detail just to analyse not just taboo issues, but taboo issues from her own life, which even nowadays is courageous, but back in the 70s.
Just a quick word on the scandal you were mentioning before. There was one year where the Nobel Prize was even cancelled, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't that correct?
Yes, this was
For
back
literature.
in 2017. There was a sexual assault scandal linked to one of the members of the Swedish Academy, and the prize was cancelled in 2018. So they have made changed their criteria, changed their rules. They're kind of a very, very ancient, prestigious, ritualistic committee, and they've updated things really in order to keep their place within the Nobel structure, because that was under threat, really, wasn't it?
But so it's interesting, right? Because you mentioned the long list and the short list, which of course we know that they create a long list and a short list. We know that they receive kind of 200 submissions, if you like, then they whittle that down to 20, then to 5, and then we get the final one in this year, Annie Ernaux. But we are not privy to that process, unlike other prizes like the Booker, the Goncourt, where we see the long list and the short list. We have no idea what happens behind closed doors. There's a lot of speculation every year about what happens, but the truth is it's a black box speculation.
And how long can that last in this century, this opaqueness?
And so Annie Ernaux has won this year's Nobel Prize for Literature. But interestingly, those awards haven't always really gone to writers. Just to wrap up, I saw in the past Winston Churchill, Bob Dylan. I mean, you wonder what goes through the minds of the juries at times.
Yeah, sometimes they really throw a curveball. This year, we're in steady water, but
I think it's a prize for literature in the broadest sense of the word. So non-fiction, poetry, plays. I think it's really important too to remember that not everyone they pick becomes famous and canonical. So if you and I and Kathy were to look at a list of past winners from the past century, many of these names would mean absolutely nothing to us. And they also totally missed out on celebrating people like Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Marcel Proust. So we're very delighted for Annie Ernaux this year, but I think we take our delight with grains of salt.
Thank you so much to both of you. Alice McCrum, a programming manager at the American Library in Paris. Kathy Clifford from France 24. Thanks to both of you. Annie Ernaux, who won this year's Nobel Prize for Literature, a French author, Cocorico for all of us. You should check her out. Thanks for watching.